Okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager with Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today with Linda Bloomberg, who is going to talk about ways to present and share your findings. But first, if you're new to MethodSpace, this is a researcher-to-researcher blog community hosted by Sage Publishing, and we're interested in everything to do with designing, conducting, research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And you can see at the center of this Venn diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's why I love having this kind of an opportunity to talk with researchers, because I always learn something too. So, Linda, why don't you begin by introducing yourself and this series?
Thanks so much, Janet, and thank you so much to Sage and Sage MethodSpace for inviting me to present this interactive dialogue series on qualitative research designs. Today's presentation is the fourth in the series of four, and today we're going to be talking about how to discuss, explain, and share qualitative research findings, which basically is the dissemination of findings. So the first three in the series were how to choose a qualitative research design. We then went on to talk about what data to collect, how, and from whom. And the third one, which is the one prior to this, was analytic methods, how to choose ways of analyzing your qualitative data based on the research design that you have chosen. Today, we're going to talk more about how to present the findings. I also just want to mention that I come from a multi-year experience in qualitative research. I am proud to be the author of Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, a roadmap from beginning to end, which I've published with Sage starting in 2008. The book is now in its fifth edition, and I'm really honored and thrilled to be a Sage author and to be able to present these resources for Sage as we're doing today. So let's get started. Research is multifaceted. As we know, there is so much that goes on in social science research, qualitative and quantitative research, and methods. And really, research has come down to really trying to address the problems of our society today, how to really bring about meaningful findings that can support what we are trying to explore and to investigate. And for qualitative research, that really is about drilling down to the very depths of a social science problem to try and better understand it. This is opposed to quantitative research, which is more about plowing the broader field of inquiry. So whereas qualitative research is very much focused on a specific research problem and that drilling down, in quantitative research, broader data is gathered from a much larger sample of research participants. In qualitative research, we're really looking at a small group of participants and their experiences. And so we look at a small purposeful sample of individuals that we have selected to be part of the research study. In quantitative research, in contrast, we're looking at this much broader population, which is we apply random sampling, and we then attempt to generalize the findings of the study to the broader population. So those are the two main specific features of qualitative and quantitative research that diverge from each other. But ultimately, with all types of research, we are looking to focus on issues that deserve attention in order to bring about greater understanding and knowledge, which we then want to share with our communities and with a broader audience. And that is the purpose of today's presentation. How do we share qualitative research findings with a broader audience once we have actually conducted our studies? Again, I just want to be a little bit more specific about qualitative research, that we all have a real clear idea of what qualitative research entails. Remember, it is suited to promoting a deep understanding of a social setting or activity from the view of the research participants themselves. The emphasis is on exploration, discovery, and description. The researcher is considered the instrument of data collection and data analysis. Our research questions are open-ended as opposed to closed-ended. We are not looking for yes, no answers, but rather a much deeper descriptive answers that come from our research participants themselves. Our sample selection, as I mentioned a few moments ago, is purposeful rather than random or non-probability sampling as what occurs in quantitative research. The goal is not to produce truths that can be generalized, but rather for readers to decide for themselves whether the findings of a study can apply to their own settings and contexts, a concept known as transferability. This is really something very important to keep in mind when we're talking about presenting our findings, because we want our readers of our studies and our audiences to decide for themselves whether they feel that what they are hearing and reading can apply to their own context or settings, and in what ways. So that is really the goal of qualitative research, to share our findings so that our readers can decide for themselves on the value and applicability of those findings. And again, a qualitative researcher, as any researcher, needs to be very transparent about their positionality, as this shapes the entire research process as well as the research findings. So that is really a broad overview of key features of qualitative research that I'd like us to keep in mind as we go through this presentation on how to present the findings at the end of the study. Going back to the first three in the series, I'm going to say again that the major qualitative research designs, based on many of the key writers in the field, including Creswell and Denzin and others, the major qualitative research designs, and there are some others, but these major five are case study, ethnography, grounded theory, narrative inquiry, and phenomenology. We could also add action research to this. We could also add many of the critical genres, but we're going to stay with these five for now, as we have done in the previous three in the series, just in terms of clarity and directness of applicability. When we talk about research designs in qualitative research, there are significant variations in how a qualitative study can be designed and conducted. And the designs themselves are typically derived from either methods, as in the case of case study, from a philosophy, as in phenomenology, or even from a theory, as in grounded theory. And developing a sound and feasible research design for one study is really the very basics of conducting a rigorous study, because that design is like the foundation of a building. It really creates the foundational basis for the study to be built on and to be developed from. Each design encompasses specific ways of addressing a researchable problem, ways of setting up the study, and then collecting, analyzing, presenting the data that is found. The researcher really needs to ensure that the methods of data collection and data analysis will be in alignment with their selected research design. And I want to focus for a moment on that word alignment, because it's critical when it comes to selecting and deciding upon and then actually carrying out your study according to the selected design. All of the study's components must be interconnected so that the study itself is a cohesive whole. Thinking along these lines affords a research study what is called a methodological congruence. The methods that a qualitative researcher chooses are informed by the specific qualitative research design that is chosen. A solid rationale for the choice of data collection and the choice of methods to analyze that data is crucial. And being able to do this will indicate to your audience and to your readers that the choice of methods, both data collection and data analysis, are firmly grounded in the chosen research design. I also would just like to mention that ways of achieving alignment can actually be supported by a diagram that I have in the 5th edition of my book. It's figure 6.3, which clearly outline ways of aligning one's studies, research purpose, data collection, data analysis, according to the design that you choose. And again, I hope that this is a useful diagram to our audience, because it was designed with this specific task in mind, to make it feasible to set up your study and to really check yourself on all levels that you are in fact conducting a methodologically congruent study. So let's pause for a moment here and think about a specific research problem example that I have used throughout this entire series to try and give us something to build this presentation on, to make it actually something that you can envision in your mind. So what I've done is, as with the previous three presentations in this series, I've chosen a research problem that is actually mentioned in my book as well. And the problem relates to the significant number of doctoral students who complete all their coursework yet are not able to go on and write their dissertation for whatever reason. That was the actual research problem that I've discussed in the book, to a large extent based the first 4 editions of the book on, and which we're going to use today. So we're going to focus in on this problem of ABD, which is called all but dissertation. And this is going to be our example for today as we talk about presenting our research findings in alignment with the specific research designs that we're going to be looking at in this presentation, as you'll see as we move forward. And along with that research problem of ABD, all but dissertation, the purpose that we're going to be looking at as an example is the purpose of the study is to explore the experience of doctoral candidates regarding why they have not managed to complete their dissertations and hence remain ABD. So let's just have this idea in our minds of this example of ABD students, and the purpose is to explore their experiences. Now, if we keep this example in mind, let's look at the rationale for selecting an appropriate research design. First, since we are not wanting to understand a culture, we would not likely choose ethnography as a research design. That would not be a feasible option. We also would not choose grounded theory because we're not looking to develop a theory around this problem. So the 3 options that we have for design possibilities could be case study, narrative inquiry, and phenomenology. And what we're going to do in the presentation going forward is to actually examine each of these 3 designs in greater detail to see how one would present research findings based on the design that is chosen. So let us look for a moment as case study as option number 1. Now, as most of us know, those of us who have been involved in qualitative research for a long time, and even those people who are new to it, case study is an in-depth exploration from multiple perspectives of the richness and complexity of a bounded system. So in other words, the system has boundaries, and the system can be a social unit, such as a program, an event, an institution, an organization, or even an entire community. Yin, who's one of the key proponents of case study research and case study design, categorizes case studies as exploratory or descriptive. Exploratory is used to explore situations in which a phenomenon is unclear or has unclear outcomes, and descriptive is used to describe a phenomenon in great detail and the real-life context in which it occurred. Robert Stake, who's one of the other key proponents of case study research and case study design, identifies case studies as either intrinsic or instrumental. And also he talks about a primary distinction in designing case studies as that being the difference between a single and multiple case study designs. And he writes very clearly about these different designs and also about intrinsic and instrumental case studies. And I urge anybody to take a closer look at his writing as well as that of Yin, because their writing is really seminal in the world of case study design. So going back to our specific example of ABD, all but dissertation, and trying to explore more deeply as to why this occurs, if we were doing case study design, if we were using this as our research design, the purpose would be, for example, with an exploratory case study, to explore the perceptions of doctoral candidates regarding why they have not managed to complete their dissertation. And an appropriate research question could be, what reasons do doctoral candidates give for not completing their dissertation? So this is the way we can try and set up a case study design for this research problem. And then let's take a look at, and this is the real point of today's presentation, how would we present our findings if we had chosen a case study design? So in addition to thick, rich description, a researcher's interpretations, conclusions, and recommendations are key with case study design. The findings must of necessity illustrate a logical and meaningful response to each of the study's research questions. And we would also be looking at a detailed description of the themes that emerge from the cluster of codes when we analyze that data. So our findings are very much a description of the themes that have emerged in response to each of the study's research questions. The findings are reported in a narrative manner and would include extensive samples of verbatim quotations from our research participants. That means that our transcriptions of the interviews or focus groups would have been coded either manually or by way of software to develop codes, and then groups of codes would have been grouped together to develop the key themes that emerge in response to the study's research questions. And when I say verbatim quotations, I really mean word for word what our research participants have told us in response to our interview questions or our focus group questions. So we would then collect those groups of quotations, which are the participants' actual words, and present these in our findings. We could also use vignettes, which could be followed by a detailed description of the case and its contents. And vignettes are a great way to present case study findings because here you present small stories of each of the research participants themselves. In addition to all the narrative that we're presenting, be it our own interpretations as well as the participants' words themselves, we could use tables, figures, charts, matrices, and other imagery to serve as visual graphics to go along with our narrative to further illustrate the findings that we're trying to convey. So there we have case study design as our first option. Let's take a look now at narrative inquiry as a second option for a research design, given that very same research problem and research purpose, which is to examine why ABD occurs, why all but dissertation as a problem occurs out in the world and why students do not manage to complete their dissertations. Same as with case study, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of narrative inquiry design. Narrative inquiry, in essence, focuses on how individuals assign meaning to their experiences through the stories they tell. Narratives are always interlinked between an individual and the social or cultural context in which they find themselves. Narratives are never isolated or looked at independent of context. And that makes sense because if we're looking at anybody's story, we really have to look at it within context in which that story is occurring. We cannot just take it out of context. So participants, our research participants, would tell their stories of their experiences, and the researcher inquires into and about those experiences through the data collection, through an interview, through a focus group, through a critical incident questionnaire, even through observation. The researcher is trying to better understand the experiences of the research participants themselves. And this approach to research, the narrative inquiry design approach, is essentially about studying the life experiences of others as a storied phenomenon. And that's a really great concept, a storied phenomenon. So we are listening to the stories of others and trying to retell them as the researcher. Here you can see there are slight nuanced differences between this research design and case study, as we spoke about earlier. Case study is not focused on stories as such. It's focused on the participants' experiences and perspectives. But with narrative inquiry, we're really trying to convey the participants' stories. And so here, again, before I go on, I just want to make very clear, because our purpose is to convey the stories, that will determine the way that we present or disseminate our findings, which again is the purpose of today's presentation. So with narrative inquiry, the researcher works to discover the individual storied experiences through narrative threads, tensions, plot lines, coherences, silences, and then composes a narrative account of the participant's storied experience. So the researcher has to compose this narrative account. Again, this makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about how are we going to present our findings if we have chosen narrative inquiry as our research design. Restorying is the process of gathering the stories of our participants, analyzing themes, and then rewriting these stories. But remember, we cannot forget that the stories must be rewritten in exactly the way that our participants have told them. So this is a really nuanced research design that requires a lot of skill and thoughtful thinking so that we can actually do credit to our participants' stories and not misinterpret anything that they are telling us. That is what we owe our research participants when they have taken the time to share their stories, very often painful stories, as we know. Narrative researchers inquire into the institutional, social, cultural, and familial narratives in which each of their research participants' experiences are embedded in order to determine how these experiences are shaped. We really want to know how and why individuals are telling the stories that they are telling. And so if we go back again to our specific research example, which was ABD, why our doctoral students have not managed to complete their dissertations, if we're doing a narrative inquiry study, using narrative inquiry as our research design, remember this is different to case study, so our purpose and our questions are going to be somewhat different as well. If we're doing a narrative inquiry study, the purpose would be to collect the stories of doctoral students to better understand their reasons for not completing the dissertation. And a research question could be, what stories do doctoral students tell as to why they did not manage to complete their dissertation? If you go back to previous slides, when you view this presentation, look at this example of the purpose and the research question alongside the previous example with case study, and you'll see that there is a nuanced difference. Even though we're looking at the same research problem, we are using a different research design. And that is where the presentation of the findings is also critical, because we're going to present findings in a narrative inquiry study somewhat differently to how we presented them in a case study. In a narrative inquiry design, the researcher can take a literary orientation or a chronological approach. In other words, the chronological approach is the way the stories can change over time. That is one of the key features of narrative inquiry design, and the way that it impacts the way that the ways it impacts the presentation or dissemination of findings. The researcher presents the participants' stories while at the same time remaining critically reflective about how their own personal and political and cultural and social and emotional backgrounds and agendas impact the research process. Again, this brings into question, or not question, but it highlights the importance of the researcher being very transparent about their own agenda, their own positionality in relation to their research participants and the research site, so that research readers of the research are going to really understand the researcher's position in the study, which is really critically important when it comes to qualitative researcher, because the researcher is the instrument of data collection and data analysis. So maybe you're also getting a feeling about how all of these critical and really significant parts of the study all must come together if we are intent on producing rigorous qualitative research, which is my passion and something I'm very dedicated to in working with my students, that each and every study be a methodologically congruent and ethical study, so that our readers have confidence in what we have found and what we are actually presenting. The researcher's reflexivity will shape how they restory the participants' account. So it's critical that the researcher remain in touch with their own part of the study as the researcher. So there we have now two different approaches, case study and narrative inquiry, very different research designs that are very feasible for qualitative research, but based on the choice of design, we can see how the researcher positions themselves somewhat differently in the study because of that design, specifically because of that design. So the way the study is set up, the way the purpose and the research questions are set up, and then the way the data is actually presented and disseminated as the research findings. And finally, let's take a look at the third option for this particular research problem, which is phenomenology. And you'll see how now with this third example, with this third option, there is a complete different way, once again, of setting up the study, devising a research purpose, setting up and devising and developing a feasible research question, and then ways to present the study's findings. Let's, as we did with the previous two research designs, let's spend a few minutes looking at phenomenology as a research design in its own right, just to have it fresh in our minds before we go on to talk more about how to set up a study and disseminate the findings if we are using a phenomenological design. First, it's important to remember that phenomenology is both a philosophy as well as a research design. And understanding the underlying philosophy is as important as understanding the research techniques and methods. The goal of this philosophy, of this philosophical design, is to understand what is called the lived experiences of others in order to identify the core essence of human experience by describing the research participants' lived experiences. And various writers in the field, including Mistakis and Van Manen and others, have really studied the background and philosophy of phenomenology as it developed over the years, and developed this research design based on that philosophy, which is really incredible that a philosophy has actually led to a research design, and that it can really bring so much value and meaning to qualitative research, which it does. Now, remember, while case study was focused on gaining a better understanding of the case, and narrative inquiry was focused on the stories that people tell, phenomenology focuses on individuals' lived experiences to better understand the essence of those experiences. The focus is not on the research participants themselves or the world that they inhabit, but rather the meaning or essence of the interrelationship between the two, the experience and the event. So here we have a really, really nuanced research design, which is really trying to get to the core of that lived experience of our research participants. In doing so, the researcher has to bracket their own experiences and beliefs in order to understand the participants' experiences. And when I say bracket, this is one of the key features of phenomenology, which some of the key writers in the field have spoken about. Bracketing is actually referred to as epoch. That is one of the key terms that is used in the field of phenomenology, where it refers to the researcher suspending their own biases, their own assumptions, their own judgment, in order to stay so very, very focused on describing and analyzing the phenomenon, which is the lived experience of our research participants. And I just would like to read a quote from Mistakis, where he says, "The challenge of the epoch is to be transparent to ourselves, to allow whatever is before us in consciousness to disclose itself, so that we may see with new eyes in a naive and completely open manner." This is such a profound statement, and as we know, as human beings, it is so very, very difficult to ever remove ourselves from our own sense of right and wrong, from our own sense of judgment, from our own perspectives, from our own point of view. But it's critically important that we be transparent, completely transparent about what we believe to be true, but also try in the best possible way to put that aside while we're doing our research and keep that open mind in order to listen receptively and completely to our participants' descriptions of their lived experience. So again, as we did with case study design and narrative inquiry design, let's take a look at our example of ABD, or but dissertation, and see what would our research purpose and research question be if we were using a phenomenological design. And again, as I said previously, when you go back and listen to this presentation, try and take a look at the previous slides that I presented, exactly the same for case study design and narrative inquiry, and try and look at them side by side to see how the purpose and the research question would shift subtly because of the design that we've chosen. So if we are using a phenomenological design, the purpose would be to understand the lived experiences of doctoral students who made the decision not to complete their dissertation. And the research question would be, what lived experiences in a doctoral student's program led them to decide not to complete their dissertation? So again, if you look at these side by side, you will see that this purpose and research question are subtly nuanced and different from a case study design and from a narrative inquiry design. And based on the findings that we find from our phenomenological study, how do we present those findings? Again, the ways that we present the findings are going to be significantly different if we had used a case study design or a narrative inquiry design, as I discussed previously. So here, with a phenomenological study, the focus is on the development of the essence of participants' lived experiences rather than explanations or analysis of those experiences. And think about that for a moment. This is very different to case study and even narrative inquiry. The researcher is not looking to analyze the experiences themselves. but rather to understand the essence of the participants' experiences. And that is why bracketing is such a key concept in phenomenology, because the researcher really has to bracket their own assumptions and biases to fully understand the experiences of others. The purpose is to reduce individual experiences by describing what participants may share as they experience the common phenomenon. And in addition to commonalities, we also look at the ways in which the findings will diverge from the commonality of the lived experience. So we're really looking at not developing something that is common to all, but let's also look at each of these experiences in its own right and try and understand each one for what it brings to the table. So we're not looking to draw broad conclusions. We're rather looking to drill very, very, very deeply. Again, we can look at that image, that metaphor of the drill, drilling down so deep to really understand what each participant is experiencing, what each of their lived experiences is. And so Van Manen and Moustakis, which are two of the key writers of phenomenology in the field of qualitative research, both recommend a highly structured writing approach. The researcher would write a structural description, how things occurred, and a textual description of the lived experience of the participants. In other words, what the participants experience. So there's this key delicate balance of the structural description, how things occurred and the context, as well as the textual description of the participants' experiences. In other words, what are they really experiencing in this common shared phenomenon that we're studying? In this case, ABD. Why are participants not completing their dissertations? And the researcher also would need to engage in what Moustakis refers to as imaginative variation in order to reflect on and offer all possible meanings and perspectives related to the phenomenon. So the researcher needs a lot of skill in conducting a phenomenological study, because there is a lot of skill involved in bracketing. There's a lot of skill involved in knowing how to present a structural description and a textual description, and then really engaging in imaginative variation. So you can see a highly specialized research design that requires a lot of study in order to really give credit to conducting and really know that one is conducting a rigorous phenomenological study. So I also just wanted to mention that a lot of the material that I've presented here today is available in my book, Completing Your Qualitative Dissertation, A Roadmap from Beginning to End, which I mentioned previously is currently in its 5th edition with Sage Publications. I'm really very indebted to Sage and Sage Method Space for promoting my book, for seeing the value of this book in the first place all those years ago in 2006, when I first proposed this idea. And I really do remain committed to developing qualitative research as a methodology that is clearly understood, and so that it can be applied productively, ethically, and responsibly to conduct social science research and really try and address some of the pressing issues of our times. I would like to give credit to my colleague Merle Werbeloff for the slides that I presented on slides 5 and 6. These are her images, the drilling down and the plowing of the field. And then again, all the references that I cited in this presentation are included here for your review. And I really do urge our viewers to go and look at some of these references. Some of them are seminal references, including those of Stake and Yin, among others. And again, just really very grateful to Janet Salmons of Sage Method Space and Sage Publications for inviting me to present this 4-part series on qualitative research designs, which we have now completed today, and which I know will be up on the Sage Method Space site as a free resource that Sage generously puts out for students and researchers and whoever is interested in these topics. So I'm going to hand this over again now to my colleague, Janet Salmons, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, I want to just highlight a couple of points. Some of you who are watching this may think, well, wait a minute. I mean, if what we're talking about here is how to, write and present your research, why are we going back to this design part? I thought I already finished that part. But I think the way that you've explained it, not only shows, kind of the differentiation between these 3 approaches, and one could extend this and use this model, to look at other styles. If you were considering action research or a different methodology, you could apply this same kind of comparative approach to see like what really fits. But I think what you've offered here is also kind of an entry point to different kinds of things that you can write about. So, if you are a student who is writing a thesis or a dissertation, where you are being asked to write about the entire thing, the whole study from beginning to end. But as you move forward in your research career, your academic career, you have the opportunity to write about different aspects of this. And I think what you've shown is that, there are kind of ways to writing about the problem itself, writing about the methodology and how the methodology is used, that, so don't only think about writing about the results or what you've discovered in this. The whole process of the research, provides you with a lot of food for thought that you can dig into, whether in a formal journal article, a book chapter, or even a newsletter article or an academic blog post on some place like MethodSpace, where you can talk about those elements. So I think the way that you've teased it out so precisely, should give our viewers a number of ideas about options for writing about the research.
That's a great way of looking at it, Janet. There are so many options, even if one went beyond qualitative research, as you say, to different methodologies, quantitative, mixed methods. One could look at all these 4 webinars as models or framework to write about and talk about and study the different ways in which the different research designs play out in a study and how they determine how to collect data, how to analyze data, and then how to present data, which was the purpose of this 4-part series. So yes, there are a lot of possibilities here, and students should really run with those ideas, because there are a lot of options here for journal article publications, book chapters, and which was really the key motivating factor to present this series in the first place for me, was that our students and faculty would have a deeper understanding of how design selection is really critical in setting up a study, because it impacts all these different parts that follow.
And as you've noted throughout, the role of the researcher is very different in each one of these, where, on one end of the spectrum, your own experiences, with the topic being studied, might be part of the data that you will include, and you're transparent about that. Perhaps, you struggled with your own dissertation, and, or maybe it's sat, on the shelf for a while and then you came back to it. Perhaps you had your own experiences that you discuss as a part of your presentation of the research, or on the other end of the spectrum, where, you say, I need to make a conscious, almost like a mental cleansing, before I go into thinking about, each participant's contribution to the study, to really looking at their experiences, that I'm going to step back. My experience is not relevant here. I want to really put myself, into their shoes. And when I studied phenomenology, I mean, one of the things that really made sense to me around that was not only to set your own, biases and experiences aside, to be prepared for a surprise that, maybe what you'll hear is not what you would expect, about this phenomenon, but also to not let the kind of, what you've learned from other participants kind of shape your expectations of what you'll learn from the new participants. So that, you're really trying to give, each one of those participants the attention that it deserves. So I hope that, if you're listening to this, you're thinking, oh, well, this opens up various options for writing. I mean, what, I encourage you to do after listening to this presentation, would be to just sit down and like make a list. Here are the 10, 20, however many ideas that I could write about just from my one study. You're not going to do them all at once. Begin with what you are required to do in terms of if you're a student who's completing a doctoral program, but then look at, well, where might I publish something that is about my experience as a researcher using this? Where might I publish something that would really dig into a description and explanation of the problem itself? So that you can start to look at, rather than be just simply overwhelmed, like, oh, this is way too much work, I'll never get this done. To think about it in terms of the real potential and the value of the research that you've done, and that it does go beyond simply completing your academic program.
Yeah, you've said it very well, Janet. And I think everybody watching, and even me sitting here now, there's a lot to think about. There are a lot of opportunities here for taking this further, for putting your own spin on it, for applying it to your own world, your own studies, your research problems, or your research agenda. Qualitative research is an art and a science at the same time, and it just offers so many possibilities, and it's thrilling to be part of this field. And Janet and I are both very passionate about this, about research, as I'm sure it's come across. And so I just wish students and faculty all success in taking these ideas, in using all the resources that Sage Method Space has provided, and really digging into what you've been provided with and using it. There's a lot of useful information on the site, and again, I'm so grateful to Sage and Sage Method Space for always promoting my work and really giving me a platform to share more.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll look forward to hearing some feedback from our viewers about how they've used this series.
Thanks, Janet.